Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our live coverage of Hurricane Milton this evening. I'm student meteorologist Allison Sousa, and I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about what we've already seen from the storm and some current conditions. So currently the storm is a Category 3, sitting at sustained winds of 120 miles per hour. Its pressure is at 952 millibars, and it is just about to make landfall here just north of Sarasota in Florida. This is a live look at the radar and satellite of what's going on with the storm. You can see some of those bands that produced some tornado warnings earlier today have moved offshore, but you can see the brunt of this precipitation is starting to impact the Tampa area, and we're seeing a lot of precipitation in the northern areas of Florida as well, and that will continue throughout the night. Taking a look at our infrared satellite, you can see this is showing some of our really tall cloud tops here, so definitely the southeastern part of the storm. This still has quite a few, many high cloud tops. You can see, again, some of those higher cloud tops moving into Tampa. So there's going to be those heavier bands of precipitation and some of those thunderstorms. You can also see this area over here that has finally moved off of the east coast of Florida. If we take a look at our water vapor satellite, this is showing us the humidity levels associated with this storm. You can see, obviously, the hurricane is very humid, very saturated with moisture, but you can see all this dry air that is out over the Gulf of Mexico now. This is what this storm has been interacting with for the past day. And this is part of what's caused this storm to start to weaken as it has approached land. So we're seeing some of this dry air get fed into the storm, and that is disrupting the strength of the storm and part of why it dropped to a Category 3 earlier today. So if we take a look, this is the track of the storm. This is where it has gone. So it started out here in the Gulf and it rapidly intensified into a Category 5 hurricane within a day. This was a textbook example of rapid intensification. And it was the really, really warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico that allowed this hurricane to use that fuel to become such a strong system so quickly. As it moved past the Yucatan Peninsula earlier, or a couple days ago, it was briefly a Category 4 hurricane as it interacted with that land, but quickly, as it moved back over the warm waters of the Gulf, it regained its Category 5 strength. I would like to say that it did not actually make landfall on the Yucatan Peninsula, but some of the southern bands of the storm, those did impact that area. But as it's moved closer to Florida, it's, like I said earlier, interacting with that really dry air, and there's been some wind shear that is also shearing the cloud tops off of this hurricane, and that is also allowing it to weaken. And that is why it has dropped just today to a Category 3. It was previously a Category 5 hurricane just as early as this morning, but as it's interacted with that shear, it has begun to weaken. And so if we're going to take a look, this is going to show the track as it moves out and makes landfall over tonight. So after it impacts Florida's west coast here, it is going to drop to a Category 1 hurricane fairly quickly. And then it's going to move back out over into the Atlantic, where it is going to become a tropical storm and then become a tropical depression. And so this is the cone track, which is just an area where the center could track anywhere within this cone. But as a reminder, the impacts of this storm are going to be well outside of this cone. But by Thursday afternoon, the center of the storm itself is going to move off into the Atlantic Ocean once again. And so as I mentioned earlier, these water temperatures, these are part of the reason that Milton was able to become as strong as it did. You can see the really dark colors here. These are indicative of really, really warm water temperatures. As you may have heard previously this season, the waters in the Gulf of Mexico have been anomalously warm this year, and this is why we've seen a lot of storms undergo rapid intensification. And I would like to mention as well that when this storm was at its strongest, peak winds as a Category 5 hurricane, it reached a minimum pressure of 897 millibars, which is the 5th lowest pressure ever to be recorded in the Atlantic Basin. And this is the lowest pressure since Wilma in 2005. That holds the record for the lowest pressure ever achieved by a tropical system in the Atlantic Basin. That bottomed out at 882. But once you start to see pressures in these systems get that low, that is where you just know that this is a really large storm. This is a really catastrophic and very strong storm, and we do not see this often, as I said. So this is truly a historic storm that we are talking about here. current watches and warnings, you can see hurricane warnings. These extend throughout the central region of Florida there, and along the coast as well. We do have tropical storm warnings all the way down to the southern parts of Florida. Miami, you are included in that, and also the Florida Keys. We also see some tropical storm warnings extend up through Jacksonville and up to the Georgia and South Carolina coasts there. So be mindful there as well, because again, the impacts of the storm do spread above the cone that I mentioned earlier. And as you saw, some of those rain bands were impacting Jacksonville, so you could still see some winds and some rain even into the Georgia coast there. We also have storm surge warnings in effect for this western coast of Florida here, extending almost up into the Big Bend region, but Tampa, you are under this storm surge warning, so you're going to want to really stay aware with this storm. This is going to be one of the bigger impacts for this storm on your area. But we even have some storm surge warnings up on the eastern coast of Florida here. Jacksonville, you're also under a storm surge warning, and that is because even as the hurricane starts to move offshore, you're going to have, with that counterclockwise rotation, winds are going to start to bring the water onto the eastern side of the state. So if you are under a storm surge warning, please be prepared. And we also have a tornado threat with this system. So today, as I said earlier, we already had several tornado warnings that occurred because of those outer bands moving through the state. But you can see that a good chunk of eastern Florida here, they were under a 10% risk of tornadoes for today. A good chunk of the state, including Tampa and Miami, you are under a 5% tornado risk. But even extending a little bit up farther north, you have a 2% tornado risk because tornadoes can get spun up by systems like this, especially within the outer bands of these systems. Thank you so much. We will be back in a couple minutes for more updates. Stay tuned.
Thanks to all for keeping tuned in and coming on and looking at the hurricane right now. I'm going to be talking about what's going to happen in the future as Allison and currently. I do want to look again, though, at the radar right now. You could see this hurricane bearing his eye down on Florida, but especially getting some major banding right now. They are seeing some high reflectivity. And it is a very intriguing note I want to mention that this storm has seen a lot of northward shear. A lot of the thunderstorms, and I'll talk about this in just a little bit, these thunderstorms have moved north. So even though the center of the hurricane is really where my hand is, a lot of these thunderstorms have moved north. So even though Fort Myers is not seeing a lot of rain right now, you are still seeing effects. But I do want to talk about this hurricane because it is a Category 3, but it was a Category 5 earlier in the day. So right now, infrared satellite is also showing a very similar picture. These very bright reds are showing very strong thunderstorm activity. So in the same locations where we saw a lot of rain, especially north of the storm, is where they're seeing these clouds. As well as the infrared or the water vapor satellite as well, you can see this dry spot of air trying to work its way into the storm like Allison mentioned. That's another reason why the hurricane is starting to dwindle on itself, as it is still a Category 3, still a strong storm, but you could see that dry air starting to work in and break down that moisture in that storm. Let's look at the spaghetti plots quickly as the hurricane bearing its eye down on the Gulf Coast. Right now, most model guidance shows that it will impact somewhere maybe Tampa and South Tampa, Bradenton, Sarasota, all cities where it could make landfall. If you are still in the area, you would absolutely need to get in shelter, seek some sort of some sort of interior room in your house, because this is a very, very serious threat if you are still in the area. So let's continue. This is the track where all the spaghetti plots come together. It is a Category 3 hurricane, and like I said, we'll have that northeastward track going into Florida. As it interacts with land and the rest of the trough and the dry air, it will weaken into a Category 1 hurricane as it goes interior, but with everything interacting with it, will become an extratropical cyclone once it goes off of the coast of Florida. So really, just in this time frame, the only locations that should be impacted by this hurricane will be Florida and some of the rest of the much low southeast, as in locations like Georgia, maybe coastal South Carolina, and places like that. So let's talk to you about the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. These are what hurricanes are graded on based on their speeds. So there's 5 categories. I'll start with Category 1. And even though it is the lowest category, it does still have very detrimental effects. So right now, it does have minimal damage, but you can see there's a lot of storm surge that is impeding. Leaves are starting to fly off trees. If we do increase it a little bit, that's when hurricanes start to get into the triple digits for miles an hour. Trees are starting to go even wilder. Maybe branches are starting to fall off as well. There might be some minimal damage to your house, and storm surge is even more. This is what Milton is right now, Category 3. This is when we start to get into the stronger wording with things. Devastating damage now. You could see coastal flooding is huge with that flow going into Tampa, like I said, or excuse me, places south of Tampa. This is where we'll start to see some devastating storm surge. I'll talk about it in a bit, but we're seeing double-digit storm surge. Now we're in a Category 4, catastrophic damage. Trees, if they're not bending like this, they're probably, and especially storm surge, will be bad. In Category 5, this is the highest category storm, and why we were so crazy about warning everybody in Florida of what was going to happen. This is when storms were 157 plus miles an hour with catastrophic damage, winds, flooding, and the whole 9 yards. So putting this all together with this Category 3 storm, you could see the excessive rainfall outlook. You could see a little line in Florida, exactly where the track will be, Tampa right in the bullseye, but still places like Melbourne, Daytona Beach, maybe Orlando as well, right in the center of the state with high rainfall outlooks. But as that wind field increases because of the shear, you could still see that major coverage in the state of Florida, really south of Jacksonville. A lot of Florida impacted. What does this mean with winds as well? As that hurricane goes inland, places in the middle of Florida will be impacted with hurricane force winds. A really bad storm as it goes through into tomorrow. Thursday morning, maybe we'll start to see some of those better effects as the hurricane starts to go off and weaken. Still, Florida should absolutely be keen on this hurricane making landfall tonight. Putting this as well all together, this tropical storm force wind probability brought to you by the National Hurricane Center shows a very, very wide portion of Florida. Basically the entire state without the panhandle, Tampa right in that bull's, but places like I mentioned before, Orlando, maybe Gainesville as well, and some of the Space Coast, they're in that 100% tropical storm force wind probability. And hurricane force winds as well, that is that 74 plus mile an hour winds. It's right on that side south of Tampa, and especially the Sarasota area about this storm. And also storm surge warnings as that flow goes counterclockwise. Even though the storm is making landfall south of Tampa, it's going to be in that flow, which will certainly make a negative impact on storm surge. So double-digit readings, maybe 10 to 15 feet, as the National Hurricane Center advised on, is absolutely necessary. So this storm has just been a detriment to Florida, especially with the impacts that Helene made 2 weeks ago, even though it made a different track into the Big Bend of schools closed, local governments are closed, and this is an absolutely critical situation that everybody in Florida should know. That I've been Gavin Sandel. Thank you so much for tuning in for our update on Hurricane Milton. We bless the lives of everybody that are in Florida. We hope that they're okay. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you soon.